Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me on another episode of Sitting Down with Scholars. I'm joined by Victoria, a classic graduate and a university student. And Victoria, can you start by telling myself and my guests a bit about your research or academic interests so far?
Hi. Thank you for having me. I'm, as Jordan said, a classics graduate and I'm from Belgium, the University of Ghent. My research focuses, I've done a bachelor's and a master's in classics, so Latin and Greek literature and linguistics. And then I've also done an advanced master's in literary studies, so I'm really into the ancient literature, narratology, close reading of things. My research is I've done various things for things like master's thesis and other research, but generally it always comes back to things like gender studies, characterization, and sometimes also the reception of classics. So that is kind of the general outline of it.
And I know from a lot of people who might not be as aware of what studying the classics effectively looks like, to start off with, narratology, I will admit from my own ignorance on this one, could you go into a bit more detail of what that is?
Yeah, of course. So narratology is a pretty broad term in literary studies over various languages, various literatures. And it's basically methodology that you use to analyze literary texts. So how a story is told, for example, from which person, is it first person, third person? Just how is it structured? Is it structured chronologically or rather a flashback that's going on in the story? And you can really use this on in various aspects. You can look at, as I said before, characterization. You can see from whose perspective something is told and whether that does or does not is the same as the narrator, because that is not always the case. For example, you can look at an entire text or just a very small fragment. So it's kind of a way of analyzing narrative literature.
A lot of people's backgrounds and perspectives. Most people would be familiar with what I would probably argue is more very similar tropes that tend to come up quite often again in literary text, fantasy writing. I know the most common one that comes to mind all the time is the hero's journey perspective, and equally the more Scandinavian approach, narrative storytelling. And those are probably what I can think of as a fantasy reader, some common stories that tend to have those similar themes. And just wondering if from your own perspective, what are some of you, I suppose, your not necessarily favorite, but more preferred or interesting different perspectives or different forms of storytelling?
These things like the hero's journey and stuff that you say are all part of this narratology network as well. Just asking, what do you mean with favorite way of looking?
I suppose from your perspective, reading various different texts from an academic point of view, what stories, both in history or in not common, more modern writing, what are you finding is more interesting approach from your own personal perspective to read or to study, whether it be like the hero's journey type tropes or the likes of other forms of narratology?
I must confess, so there are these specific tropes indeed, but I do not like to follow too much of such set storylines, in the sense that these can all be very limiting. And that is also a criticism that you can have with different narratological methods. Personally, I like to look more from one story to another. You will see, for example, especially in classics, that things like epic, what makes epic and what makes it a genre? Is it a specific storyline or is it more the formalist part of it? Is it because it's written in a specific poetic verse? I try to really not make it too limiting, I must say. And personally, in my research, I work a lot on characters, as I said. So with me, it would rather be, which also fits into the whole narratology thing. It would be things like characterizing techniques. There are specific works that, for example, use ancient rhetoric handbooks as a way to find categories that we could say will help us to look at characterization. Things like not just the names, but also specific narratives or the appearance of characters. And I do like This is definitely one of the things that I like, in the sense that I've worked with these kind of techniques, but they were really based on ancient Roman and ancient Greek handbooks of rhetoric. So I think I like this specific kind of methodology where you base yourself in that ancient world and you see the similarities with the more modern methods. That is definitely one that I like, I would say.
I know it's from a lot of different people's perspectives, and I was listening to a very interesting take from a philosophical point of view. And this was all focused on how much you can learn from writings, whether that, like you say, poems, stories, epics, and what you can learn from philosophy rather than philosophy textbooks. And particularly, I will say this particular creator was very critical of more the self-help and purely non-fictional element, and was more pro the storytelling type of form of philosophy. And I'm just interested on, in terms of your perspectives, what do you think in terms of, I'm thinking Greek myth specifically, how have you seen the evolution of Greek literature, both from how we use it in modern mediums, TV, and in some cases, storytelling as well, but equally from what it was the more truer forms of Greek literature and so on? Because obviously, with your background, you've had experience in both of those, I'm sure.
And what is so interesting about ancient literature, I think, is that we've always reused these stories throughout the medieval period and Renaissance and now in modern times. So, first of all, I would say that every single period has its very unique way of dealing with this ancient literature and ancient stories. That is just the first thing that I want to say. I don't think we should neglect one or the other in that sense. Although I do understand the criticism on the more modern way of using it in things like self-help and etc. And I would definitely agree with some of those. Other than that, I think that in modern ways, the ancient literature can, first of all, be empowering. And on the other hand, it can be perhaps a bit reductive. So, what I mean is, on the one hand, the way that we sometimes use these ancient stories, and especially mythology, but other, because mythology and literature are so connected in the ancient world, right? On the one hand, I think it can be empowering. I am specifically thinking about those kinds of myths where, for example, they can be empowering to the queer community, LGBT community. It's about gender bending creatures, etc. We see feminist perspectives in retellings. We see this as well. And on the other hand, I think some reusing of ancient literature can be reductive in the sense that we have this very specific view on ancient literature. And a lot of the time, it can be like it's boring or we have a lot of flat characters. And I don't think that is true either. I don't think, and this is also especially coming from when I look at the characterization at the characters in ancient literature, they can be so well rounded that if you really look at them more deeply, they are just so much more than what we would give them credit for. I have worked on the prophetess, the Sibyl in the Aeneid, halfway the Aeneid, and usually she is seen as this guide to the hero Aeneas to bring him to the underworld and to guide him, bring him there safely, get him back out. And looking at the way she is described and more through close reading, you see so many aspects of this female character that otherwise you would completely lose. So that is something that I would say, is that the characters can be way more complex and the stories can be way more complex than we sometimes give them credit for.
I think one of the examples I suppose I have come to recently from the complexities of, like you say, with certain emotions. I know in a lot of, especially in the modern retellings or portrayals of Hades and Pluto, you have a very flat, more vanilla character in terms of motives. It's not very well rounded, very antithesis of all types, not a very complex character. Whereas in a lot of literature, he's portrayed far more as a rounded, complex figure and to the same level of depth as the likes of Poseidon. And it's just, you don't see that in a lot of storytelling or a lot of literature because they use the character as the character that to try to focus individual hate or evil. It's not anything more complex than just that one note of underworld equals death and evil, therefore it must be the same.
Definitely. Now, it's interesting that you also just pointed out because we know that, especially in modern stories, or what people love a lot is also the story of Hades and Persephone. I think that's another really big one that is so popular, or just on the internet, or in retellings, or even fan fiction, which is another really complex myth, actually, that has so much more into it than just the whole love story part of this big evil god and this innocent girl. So it can sometimes people also just pick certain notions that they have without seeing other parts, or how it was able to function in a specific culture as well.
No, but it's interesting. I'm thinking about the Persephone, Demeter, and Hades. It's how a lot of ancient Greeks change the seasons. That's how they rationalized winter because of that. And as someone who's both a social scientist, who still dabbles in biology, it's interesting to see how that rationalizing changing the seasons was seen from the point of view of the people alive at the time. And that's something I find fascinating for storytelling of classics and how you can find depth to civilization, not just depth to the story itself.
Yeah, and especially with that story, indeed, it is one of the ways of rationalizing the changing of the seasons. I think that's also a very important part of it, and especially with the whole cult of Demeter to it. Something I also always like to add to that myth, apart from that, is that we have it's a gender aspect of it, because we have Hades being actually the uncle of Persephone, so much the older man and the younger woman, and also this, well, abduction of her, and Demeter being completely in tears, completely broken, shattered, is another way of the way I see it is that this myth is not just about the seasons, and it's not just the love story that people like to make of it, but a lot of it is also about the relationship between mothers and daughters, and how women in the ancient world, reality of women in the ancient world, because in the end, this is about a girl being taken away from her home to go to a husband, and the mother, well, maybe she won't see her daughter again if she's far off, like Persephone. Maybe it's very insecure existence and situation, her being so shattered. It's definitely one of those myths, the few myths actually, that also focuses on female relationships and this female suffering in a much more empathetic way, I think, than a lot of female victims in mythology are. So there are definitely multiple aspects to myths as well, and stories.
I imagine the played elements of it, like you say. Before I want to find out a bit more about what drove you down this particular research and academic path, this is more of a hopefully quick clarification. You said you also did an advanced masters on top of your masters. Now, trying to get that context for the various different education systems, what does an advanced masters look like?
Yes, so here we call it a master after master, literally, and in Dutch it would be translated like that. And so it was in literary studies, and basically it's a bit more with in depth methodologies that we learn about in literary studies. Now, most of it, I must confess, was very much about modern literature. So I like to have my own different take on it in that class, but it basically means that so you already have your master's, and then it would be a bit more of looking in depth at the research in the current research landscape, let's say, methodologies. We also had things like how to write a peer review or an abstract or an academic article. Our thesis was actually an academic article. So it's just a bit more adapted to the academic life and working in academia. We also had no exams actually where we had to study for. It was all research papers. So it's really a bit more focused on having academic output, going to a conference or symposium, things like that.
So it sounds very much similar to like very close to a PhD, but not quite as a PhD from what I'm getting from what you're saying. As close as you can get before you actually start.
It is, and you definitely saw that with the students there. They were almost all of us were had the ambition of at some point doing a PhD. So it was definitely useful for that.
And to following that academic journey, it's really interesting to know what drove you down this.
It's kind of funny because I originally did not have it planned. I did Latin in secondary school and I didn't even plan to do ancient Greek as well there, but it was because my teacher told me you should try it that I did and I actually liked it. Also, just going to university, I had a lot of doubts as to what I wanted to do, but it was all in the field of the literature or languages or philosophy or history. And it was only right before I really had to apply to a university that I was like, oh, wait, but Latin and Greek actually combines all of these things because we often see it as the start of our Western civilization, which of course there are a lot of criticisms you can add to that. So I don't entirely follow that line of reasoning, but when I was 18 years old, I did. So that's how I got into the field of classics, and I actually enjoyed it just so much that from one thing came another. And just throughout classes, I just figured a lot more that I wanted to focus on the literary part of it instead of the linguistic part of it. And just getting into contact with, I helped someone during her PhD at some point, which then introduced me a bit into the whole academic research part, which I liked. In my second year, I was able to get one of my small research things that I did for class published in a Dutch journal. So just getting into contact with that whole academic sphere and work really interested me, and really I was like, yeah, I found my thing. So now I hope to continue that.
That sounds well. Hopefully, get the opportunity to. I know where academia is for many people who haven't gone into this sphere. It's both the most fascinating and almost wonderful field to be in, but also it can be incredibly frustrating for many people at various different stages because there are little rules, regardless of discipline, fields, institutions, countries, all of which have different quirks within it, which is the bureaucratic joys of the field. But that is the nature of it. But we're those of us who are trying to stay in it, love it, regardless of its warts and all. I suppose one of the things, say about family and secondary school and so on. So, just picking up on that your inspiration point, is there any one individual who you are, or do you find that take inspiration from various things?
I definitely take inspiration from various sides. However, as with perhaps a lot of people, my mom has been a huge inspiration for me. Fun fact is that actually no one in my family is really into classics or more of the humanities. My mom is an engineer, other people in my family are more into the science and mathematicians. And so I actually got a lot of questions, not just from my family, but just in general. What I've heard a lot from secondary school onwards, so from basically from 12 years old onwards, was what are you going to do with this? How useful is this? And it's the most asked question in probably 10 years of my life. And I remember especially being so young still, now I can defend myself, but being so young and having even adults ask me, why did you pick this? It can be a bit overwhelming. And my mom has been a huge inspiration in just following your own path and defending what you think is right for you. So I would definitely say her.
Well, that's an incredible person, and it definitely supports your journey. I do want to pick up on that point, and I know from reflections on my teaching experience, one of the problems that I think happens, particularly in school, less so in college, but still definitely happen in school, is because we've got such a STEM bias in schools. that we know STEM very literal. Most teachers have pursued STEM in some way, shape, or form. Even those who have, I'd say, the subjects that might lean more humanities, such as religious studies and elements of geography, are taught from a STEM based lens, I would say. And outside of that, you've got sports and so on. But one of the challenges I tend to find with that is you don't, from a teaching point of view, you're not really educated on terms of how to support someone who wants to go into the arts, the humanities subjects like the classics, and very much from a place of potential ignorance or from lack of knowledge, you are in a position where, so what do you do with that? Where are the pathways? Where are the jobs from it? Because it's very so career focused. It's not the discovery of knowledge that you get from an academic setting. The going into more detail. I find it fascinating looking back on some of those flaws with the education system of how it presents the non-STEM subject.
Now that you said that, I remember this anecdote when I was in my last year of secondary school. And I used to follow a lot of the more difficult mathematics subjects until at the end of my secondary school career. I was like, no, I'm not going to do anything with this. So I'm just going to focus more on the languages and literature. So that's just a specific decision that you also have to make here in Belgium. And so I was in my mathematics class, which fortunately I was able to do very well because I had taken up the difficult parts earlier. So I was there, and other students were asking my teacher, oh, come on, why do we need this? Come on. And she said, you will need this in any discipline that you will get, in any type of higher education that you will do. And then she looked at me and she eventually knew that I was thinking of going into the more classics part of or the literary part. And she was like, well, except you. And it definitely felt a bit isolating in a way. As you said, I think there's in this whole also capitalist society, it's very difficult to have people understand how important the more arts, humanities, etc. are, simply because we are so focused on the usefulness of everything else. And I think that's where the art and literature teachers are very important, because it's thanks to Latin and Greek teachers that you find the beauty in it that other teachers might not know, also just because of their own lack of knowledge, not because they want to push you in a specific direction. And it can still be hard, I must confess. Sometimes I still think, like, what am I going to do with this? What career path can I go down with? Everyone says teaching, but you can teach in any subject, so it's not very specific. What I've always thought is that things like the literary studies or any artistic studies, they just show you not a specific way, but they just show you a different way of thinking that I think can be useful just in any path that you go down to. And a specific type of critical thinking, I find that very important, is that in a lot of those more literature classes, you get to be more critical of things like media, of things like art or design that you just see in life every single day. No matter what discipline you are in, you are constantly flooded by images, by texts, etc. And you have to be able to think critically on that as well, not just in a specific exact science, let's say.
I think one of the things that I found very interesting from a PhD perspective, and it changed how I think about the likes of classics, the arts, and so on, coming from more of a STEM background originally, is particularly in assessments and our schooling experience, we have a complete lack of ethics and a complete lack of, I would also argue, philosophy. Both of those are largely, I wouldn't say there is elements of them, the critical thinking, those type of this overarching skills that come and go within those camps. But it's not presented in a way because of how we assess. Take even what you're graded on your painting, graded on nature of that works very well for STEM when you're building a product. And spirit of art is influence how you feel and so on. Yes, there can be objectively that is just an awful drawing, but that can be a nuance to it because of how the individuals approach it, and that I think
trying to make everything conform to the same box that you want to put like STEM subjects in, I don't think serves the arts very well. I would argue the humanities not as much, but some of the arts are failed by how we assign that from an education's perspective.
I actually like that a lot. Definitely think that there's a truth to it being you can't always objectively assess. You learn in those more humanities, philosophy, literary classes. I think, and this is also something that during my studies, what a lot of professors have a lot is that it's not about the result that you have or present. It is not about what comes out of your research, what comes out of your. You don't want you to have this very specific answer to something. It's more about how you get there, how you reason, how you like what kind of methods do you employ, but how can you also be critical of those things. And I do like that I'm still structural issues to being graded in a specific way that just remains. But I do think that sometimes, especially like in more of a classroom setting, that it gets a bit more open. It's a bit more about co-creating knowledge instead of the teacher um, specific knowledge that you have to reproduce. And I do like this kind of dialogue that you have a lot of the time in more humanities classes. If only there was a way to also assess it that way, would be great. That takes some structural change as well, because in the end you have to get a grade, you have to get a number on something or a letter, whatever your system is. Should really be some ways of thinking from an educational perspective or from philosophers or other thinkers in that didactic or educational field on how we can really reform that.
Yeah, I would say I'm going to find, even though I would class myself still as being at the baby stage of my academic career in terms of not having the education field for that long, one of the things I would say is I would certainly class myself as a reformist. I wouldn't certainly defend our current system because I do think not only for the fact that it fails the arts and humanities, I think based on how things are changing with AI and so on, I think our education system is at least 60 years out of date because it doesn't fit the model of what we want for today. And it will have to change, but it's whether that will change quick enough or we'll try to resist it for as long as physically possible. I take your point on it's very difficult to change how we grade, light of grading the experience and the reflection, because truly someone might not care about a particular thing of how it makes them feel, and some might give you a paragraphs and paragraphs of detail. Both can technically be correct, but you can't argue you can't technically give them the same grade because one looks like it's an equal work. So that's where it becomes half assessment. But that's half the thing that makes it a bit more fun, I would say, because and that's what learning should be and assessments. I'm not saying an assessment, but even if you make the most fun assessment going, even if you include like a video game, maths exam, it would still be an assessment. But there is elements of where you can prove different points. But I do think we are resistant to that in virtually every academic system I've seen, whether like universities, colleges, schools, they all resist the fundamental shift probably. But one of the things you started off with was talking about, so from a classics point of view, from your research philosophy, what impact do you hope you have from whatever way? So whether it's in your field or in your future research, what impact do you have?
I must say, when I look at people who inspire me, people or characters, what I love a lot about them is that admirable people, they don't just achieve big things or innovative things, but they also help others in a way or inspire others in a way. And I'm always a little bit jealous because I feel like everyone whom I admire has this very specific calling, this evocation of a way that they are going to help people in the field, no matter what. Um, I would say that of course, despite like just having big dreams of, oh, I want to have innovative research, I want to um, groundbreaking things. These are all things that are about you, yourself. And I think a big thing of what I want to do, both within research and outside of academia, is have the employ classics or my research in such a way that it can inspire others, perhaps inspire kind of what I think is really important, that interested me a lot in my master's was that during a class was actually on medieval Latin, but we barely talked about medieval Latin, talked a lot about classicism and how classics still influence our way of thinking, our way of what do we think is beautiful or not, categories that we have. You can also argue like, is this really classical from the ancient world, or is it classic in the sense that it's classicist, that it's 18th century reinterpretation of the ancient world? And that works through to this day in a lot of things in our aesthetics, in the way we value art or beauty, in the way that some gendered issues as well, that we see those. So I would really like to include things like that in my research. I'm still kind of looking how or what exactly, but I would like to, those things of classicism, of gender studies or other diversity studies, and also bring the classics to other people, in the sense that the reason why I also share things like mythology on social media is because people always think that classics is very closed off discipline, and in a sense it, of course, it's always been very elitist and very white as well. I think that also because it has always existed in our minds, in our culture, in the way artists are still inspired by these stories. We talked about the retellings, etc., as well. Important that a lot of people have some kind of knowledge of classics, and also to be able to recognize certain patterns, certain narratives that are ancient, and also help with the whole critical thinking. So I think, just to round off my whole ramble, I think I would like to have a kind of outreach where I, bring classics a bit more into the general public, so it can inspire, so it can people think critically about things. Yeah, kind of classics as a way to change things, to change ways of seeing. Well,
Definitely fascinating, and very. One of the things that I find from, if you were to ask, if we would have this conversation before I did for philosophy side of one of the things that I never really thought about, but you really highlighted while in that example, was the more Western individualist and the Eastern pluralist perspective. Even STEM-based literature, you see elements of this, and particularly you see this in Indigenous communities where there's more of a pluralistic societies versus the individualistic focus. And just looking at it from that perspective, in West, the more individualistic side is very product driven. What does it do? How is it going to generate growth? Whereas more pluralistic perspective, who does it serve? How does it support? And it's similar to how we can apply that same philosophical foundation to business, science, humanities, anthropology, the likes of whichever subject you want broad, you can apply it to virtually any. Still, the contrast between those create issues today is very simple. That is really good in the STEM perspective, but that's for what excites.
really excites me, actually really links into that idea that classics can be a much more open field than it is. So, as I said before, classics has always been this very male dominated, white, European centered field, very closed off. And there is also this, seems sometimes kind of difficult to get into, even now, where I'm probably not only where I'm from, but it's as if only the smartest people in the room, only the ones with the best grades, like they can do it. And also because it is deemed that useful, it's just more time with dead languages and no one really could care about. What excites me is this that we see to open up the field, the discipline. There was at my university, one of the teachers that I really looked up to. She was more about the educational side as well, and she had this project. She would take classic studies to a primary school, and especially primary schools where there were a lot of children from privileged backgrounds, and she would actually teach the basics of like Greek, how to write it, etc. And I actually found with this project that the pupils were more confident in themselves, that they believed that they could actually pursue more education later on in life, etc., which I think is a really amazing way to employ such a sort of elitist discipline and really use it for some kind of social change. Also excites me is that just because classics is such an old discipline, and since the ancient world it has pretty much always existed, is that I really feel connected to in history, because it's the basis of so many great intellectuals. It has inspired so much. I always say that in a way it is classics have cracked the code to living forever or something, kind of how I see it. And I think that's really fun, and it really excites me to see how it is transformed in the use it, in the way it can help others, in the way we can look at it from different perspectives and modern methods, etc. So I think that's definitely a really big thing.
I love the idea of looking perspective, and this is whilst we talk about more the philosophical side of anything for a lot longer than we thought. So, what I want to cover is the power of your story backwards or say. Now, Doria, you are the first one that's going to read that questions here. To start off with, so who is a character or individual that you would like?
My mum, Emma Watson, and Elle Woods.
If you heard it's 11, and I can't remember Al Woods, that's
Yes, quick flick, but it's very inspiring. So
what is a life lesson that is stuck with?
always believe that you can be the anomaly.
Okay. What was a subject that you dismissed in school that you wish you did more of or used it?
I never really dismissed anything, but more art history.
Okay. What is the most recent book you've read?
Lavinia by Ursula K. Le Guin.
I don't know. I've not heard of the book, but I will definitely look it up.
It's a retelling, so it's very
And if you had a theme song, what would it be?
Vision Doga has this waltz. I think that's my favorite piece of music. So
And what was your favorite thing about your academic journey?
coming into contact with new ways of thinking,
On the flip of that, what was the worst thing about your academic experience?
doubting myself and my abilities.
How would you like to be seen or perceived by other people?
As someone who won't judge you.
If you were to do your career entirely all over again, what would you do instead?
Intern and do more volunteering work, try new things.
If you were giving advice to a student who was just starting out, what would that advice
Always trust yourself, your ambitions, your opinions, your capabilities.
be? Okay, that is the revamped questions of telling your story in 10 words or less. And please do expand on any of those points. I'd love to hear more about all of them. Please do slip to them. And straight back into some of the more expansive questions. How would you say your academic heritage was shaped?
I would say that generally, first with the field of classics, it has definitely given me kind of points that we've talked about before, like a different outlook on life, and just nothing is People sometimes say it's not that deep. Well, it's always that deep, and I definitely look at everything in this very specific view of like, there is much more to it, or there is this whole narrative behind it that we are telling ourselves, or that we are reinforcing or breaking with. This has definitely also come from specific professors, I think, who are very passionate about what they do, but who are also not afraid to use interdisciplinary tools to really look beyond their own very specific field of research. Have definitely inspired me, and there aren't always much of them because we live in such you have become such an where you have to be hyper specialized in a specific thing, but definitely professors or researchers who are able to look at various fields and have good critical opinions on various fields definitely inspired me throughout my thinking and work.
Now, it's interesting because I know thinking about fields like, for example, with that you have the contrast of the very applied sociology. These are the levels of policy change, future impacts itself. And then you have the direct sociology, which leans, I would say, my outside perspective, more to a classic way of thinking of this is how people think, this is why we think, more philosophical, which is, like you say, it's fascinating. You can have interdisciplinary relationships within a subject as well as interdisciplinary outside of a subject, where policy links to politics, business, and science, or where you have the more the practical, which leans more into arguably relationships between metaphysics, ethics, and so on. And it's interesting to see how interdisciplinary can go, internal and external, when people think about it broadly.
And it's also just so necessary in a way. You always have to have a broader outlook, and even in your own field, even if you are highly specialized in something, then it's also about, I think, inspiration and creativity. If you have a lot of different interests, connections outside of your own work, then it can oftentimes also inspire you or help you look at your own work in different way.
No, completely agree. And as someone who speaks, by looking outside the field, you get a better understanding of what you want to do. So I would 100% your perspective. And one of the next questions is more of a forward into your potential academic career. If you were given an infinite pot of money, or let's say it's sizable, now have the option of choosing how you spend your time. You have outreach, teaching, and research as what I would call the overall.
At this point, I would definitely put most towards research. So let's just say like to 60% or something. Because I'm still at the very beginning. Then I would continue, I think, with outreach, with research and finding ways to bring it out there. And teaching would right now be less of a priority. So that would get least right now, simply because on my own journey, I don't feel like I have that much to teach right now. I think it all starts with the content, with the research, and then you gradually bring it out there. So that's kind of how I would.
And like you say, it's always interesting to find not only the different field perspective on that question, but also perspectives from level of time in the field. Because a lot of senior academics approach that more from, oh, I do a lot more outreach now than I ever do my research, and more junior academics take more of the research. But before we go into the penultimate, one thing I want to know about, because more of a curiosity from my own, what's your take as someone who studies the classics and I would say the heart of the story? Your take on AI in its field?
It's a little funny where I am from now, also with my advanced master's degree now. Really come from a place where we were all kind of anti AI. It's always funny to see when I interact with people outside of the literary and the classics fields how much more normalized it is. Um, would say that, and I think I can speak for multiple people within my discipline, but I'll just speak for myself, of course, is that there is definitely nothing, in sense, there is nothing really wrong with AI or using it. It's just what you are using it for. Um, from the more artistic literary fields, I think using it is much less desired because in the end what you are studying is studying what is created by human beings, and there is still this notion that we have something that artificial intelligence simply doesn't. So who can better analyze than we ourselves, right? I think of a lot of students using it for explaining topics, for writing parts of or even entire essays. I think it also kind of misses the point both of the education and of AI in itself, because that is not what it should be for. Like also to the ways of assessing things that we've talked about. Essentially, if you are, as a student, for example, if you are using AI to help with your project, to help with your essay, etc., you're kind of missing the point of what you are being assessed on, because the whole point, especially in these more humanities disciplines, is that you can really think for yourself and you can analyze things for yourself. It is not about having a specific outcome or right answer. And I think it can be very dangerous to use AI in that sense, because it is pushing you towards a specific outcome, towards a specific answer to a question. Whereas in reality, in these fields, you don't have one right answer. It's just losing a lot of diversity. And I think that that can be dangerous, or something that we should really look out for, is that it doesn't get too homogeneous and that the diversity still exists.
No, I think that's an excellent way of putting it. And I think, like you say, equally based on the assessment point, it misses the journey side of the assessment and the learning experience that you, because it breaks that method up and basically gives you the output. That I use a maths analogy: when you're taught maths in school and they say how you did the work, show your method, and that you're basically not displaying your method, you're just giving the answer. Yes, you have provided the answer, but you missed them. Right. But because we've got just a short amount of time, Victoria, what I would love to know your answer to my movie sketch question, which is your favourite Greek myth or story, and what do you feel it is taught us as? What do you think?
So my favorite myth, it's actually quite a personal way. I mean, I indeed think of what can people learn from this and how can we see it. But when I think of my favorite myth, it's actually just because I personally like it a lot. And it's the story of and Hippomenes. I don't know how the English pronunciations are, but those are the two. And basically the whole point is that Atalanta is this so she's this typical archetype of like with Artemis, so this young girl, wild, um she has to marry, but she says to her father like, I will marry, but only if a man can defeat me in a game of in running, because she's an extremely fast runner, and otherwise I just think it's at their horse, I think she says. So many men compete with her and she always wins, until at some point Enes, he asks help from Aphrodite, and he is able to win the game by essentially having these golden apples and throwing them on the side so that she's distracted, and she's like, oh wow, what's this? It's golden apple. And so he eventually wins. Now it ends partly well in the sense that they get happily married. Doesn't end well if you think of the further part of the myth where make love in a temple and they get punished for it and they get turned into lions. But anyway, there's always a good part and a bad part to every myth. I think it's the Greek cynicism that's typical. But what I like is that there's, first I liked it because of the whole idea that this girl and she doesn't want any man, and then there is some kind of true love, we would say now, even though that's definitely not the case in such myths, but still. There is also just so much to unpack in such stories, and so much that you can also see now, the whole of being hard to get, but then eventually the man does get the girl, etc. You can find so many things like you can link it to ancient religion and the Artemis. You can link it to gender relations back in the ancient world and even sometimes now. You can romanticize it, you can critique it, and I think that that is just, it's in a way very typical of a lot of those mythological stories, is that you can take it and make it into something beautiful and romantic, or you can be more cynical about it and critique it. And I think that's something that it just holds for a lot of those stories.
I think it's interesting, like you said, the various sides of it. Well, rather than a coin, it's both sides of a dice type thing, which is interesting to think about how it can be taken, twisted, or but what would be your question then for guests? You don't know their research, you don't know their content educators or whatever. What would be your question for them?
I want to ask them that if they could work with just about any person, any institution, even just about anyone in the world, like who would they want to work with on a research project or a different kind of project, and why would that be? Some of my research or sharing some creative endeavors. So those three would be the mains.
Thank you, and I'm sure that'll be both an interesting and a challenging one. So, well, thank you, Victoria, for joining me on this week's Our Scholars. And for anyone who wants to follow along with your academic journey, what platforms can they find you on? And I will tag them in the various captions.
I mainly post on TikTok and on Instagram, and sometimes a bit on Substack, but that is a bit more about it. That's another way of kind of